The storm didn't just fall over high Mesquite Valley that night, it came down like molten iron, hammering the earth until the whole desert groaned beneath it. Jonah Hale reined in his horse when he spotted the overturned wagon, its wheels split open like a broken bone steaming under the rain. And then he saw her. A lone Apache woman knelt beside a motionless body, her braids heavy with water, her hands trembling as if the storm had torn something out of her. When she lifted her face toward him, lightning carved her grief into something unforgettable. "I'm all alone now," she whispered, for a man who had spent years outrunning his own ghosts. Jonah felt something strike deep, something that made him dismount, even though every instinct begged him to ride on. Dawn crept slowly over high Mesquite Valley, dragging pale silver across the soaked desert as if the storm had scraped every color from the land. The mesquite trees still dripped, their branches smelling of wet smoke. Mud clung to Jonah Hale's boots as he stepped away from the ruined wagon, the cold morning air cutting through the lingering heat of the night before. A distant coyote cried somewhere beyond the low ridges, its voice thin, almost mournful, as though it sensed the death the storm had left behind. This corner of Arizona territory had always been a place caught between worlds, ranchers pushing for more land, drifters moving with the cattle seasons, and Apache families who had lived with the desert long before fences scarred it. Folks spoke soft when certain names were mentioned. Folks judged loudly when people didn't look like them. That truth hung in the valley like dust that never settled. Sahale stood a little apart from Jonah, her silhouette framed by a strip of bruised pink sky. Her pale buckskin dress clung to her legs, darkened by rain and dirt. Her long black hair, once neatly braided, fell in damp strands around her shoulders. Even covered in mud, she carried a quiet dignity, chin lifted, spine unbroken, though grief weighed heavy on her features. Her eyes, dark and watchful, flickered with something Jonah couldn't name: strength. Maybe. Defiance. Maybe. Or simply a heart refusing to collapse even after the world had taken everything. The storm hadn't softened her, it had revealed her. Jonah pretended not to glance at her too often, but he kept catching himself doing exactly that. He noted the small piece of hammered iron she clutched in her left hand like a talisman. He didn't ask about it. The desert taught every man when to speak and when silence was the kinder choice. He adjusted his coat, feeling the familiar pull of the old scar along his ribs, a wound earned in a night he didn't talk about. Years of drifting from ranch to ranch had carved his body into lean muscle, the kind built from long rides, rough weather, and work done without complaint. His jaw carried the shadow of a beard, his eyes the hollowed tiredness of a man who hadn't slept well in years. People met him and always said the same thing: Jonah Hale looked like someone who stayed only as long as he needed to, then moved on before the world asked anything of him. But this morning, something in him felt less sure of that. The valley smelled of wet clay and morning chill. Smoke rose from the wagon's broken lantern, mixing with the sharp scent of iron. Overhead, the clouds rolled apart just enough for the sun to slip through, casting a soft glow on the two figures standing there, one cowboy who had nowhere to belong, and one woman whose world had been washed away in a single night. Jonah cleared his throat, not trusting his voice. Sahale didn't look at him, but he could see her breath tremble in the cold air. They were strangers bound by storm, by death, and by a silence neither of them knew how to break. And yet, as the valley stretched open beneath the lifting sky, Jonah felt the faintest shift inside him, like a door easing open, letting in a sliver of light he wasn't ready for. The wind gnawed at the valley long after the storm had passed, scraping across the flats as Jonah led Sahale toward the nearest line shack. His horse snorted, uneasy with every gust that rattled the yucca stalks. The horizon glimmered with puddles reflecting a washed-out sky, but the chill clinging to the air told Jonah the night would drop its weight heavy and merciless. No one survived alone out here, not a cowboy, and certainly not a grieving Apache woman who had lost her horse, her shelter, and her father in one blow. The shack came into view as a squat shadow perched against a low ridge, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Jonah pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped aside so Sahale could enter first. Dust rose in a tired sigh when she crossed the threshold. Inside, everything smelled of old wood, forgotten coffee, and the faint echo of men who had passed through seasons before them. Sahale stood just inside the doorway, not moving, her eyes sweeping the room with the caution of someone taught never to assume safety. "You can take the cot," Jonah said quietly. "Floor's dry enough for me." She didn't answer, didn't even seem to breathe, only watched him with a stillness that made the room feel smaller. Jonah busied himself with the stove, striking a match with numb fingers. Sparks caught slowly, coaxing a weak flame into life. The small glow softened the harsh angles of the room, and for a moment, even the shadows seemed to step back. Sahale removed her soaked blanket and hesitated. "Turn away," she murmured. Jonah did, without a word. He listened to the soft, dragging sound of wet buckskin peeled from skin, the rustle of fabric being wrung out, the fire cracked, throwing warmth against his shoulders. Only when she said, "You may look," did he turn back. She was wrapped now in an old wool blanket pulled from a cedar chest, her damp hair darkening the fabric. The blanket swallowed her frame, but her eyes sharp, watchful, remained steady. She held the small iron talisman in her hand, her thumb brushing its curved edge over and over, as though grounding herself. Jonah gestured toward the stove. "It'll warm soon." Her gaze flicked to the flames. "It's enough." Silence fell, the kind that pressed against the ears. Jonah sat on the floor near the door, stretching his legs, rubbing his palms together against the lingering cold. Sahale lowered herself onto the cot, but she didn't lie down. She stayed sitting, knees drawn close, her fingers wrapped around that piece of iron as if it were the last familiar thing she had left in the world. Jonah cleared his throat, unsure why he felt the need to fill the quiet. "Storm like that don't come often. Lucky we found shelter." Her head lifted slightly. "Not luck." "What then?" She hesitated, then replied, "My father used to say the land chooses who survives it." Jonah didn't know how to respond. He'd survived enough nights in the desert to suspect she might be right. Another stretch of quiet settled between them, broken only by the whine of wind slipping through the window frame. Jonah found himself studying her face, its angles softened by exhaustion, yet held firm by a will he did not understand. She was tired, grieving, drenched in sorrow, but she did not fold. He respected that more than he could say. "Back there," he said at last. "When you told me you were alone, I'm sorry you had to say it." Her eyes flicked toward him, unreadable. "The storm took what was left. I spoke only truth." He nodded, feeling an unexpected ache move through his chest. "You don't have to speak it again tonight." A faint shift crossed her expression, something like surprise, something like relief, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She looked back into the fire, letting its light draw shadows under her lashes. Jonah leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't sure when he had last shared a room with someone without feeling trapped. Strangely, the quiet presence of the woman on the cot didn't suffocate him. If anything, it kept the ghosts away. Outside, the desert winds circled the shack, rattling the loose boards and carrying the distant cry of nightbirds. Inside, two strangers sat in uneasy peace, their pasts unspoken, their futures uncertain, bound only by the thin walls of an old shack and the fragile thread of a night that had brought them together. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the first moment their lives began to turn toward one another. Cross Creek Ranch rose from the valley like a promise, weather-worn fences, a low barn darkened by years of sun, and a wide porch where Martha Cross liked to hang laundry that snapped like white flags in the breeze. By the time Jonah and Sahale arrived, the storm clouds had drifted off toward the mountains, leaving behind a washed, almost tender quiet over the land. The ranch dogs barked in greeting before falling strangely still, as if sensing the gravity of the two soaked figures approaching. Martha Cross stepped out first, hands on her hips, apron dusted with flour. Her eyes widened at the sight of Sahale, at the mud on her dress, the exhaustion on her face, the grief she carried like a second skin. But Martha's voice held no fear, no judgment, only warmth. "Come in, child," she said. "Storm like that shouldn't leave anyone outside." Ephraim Cross appeared behind her, broad-shouldered, beard silvered with age. He clapped Jonah on the arm without asking why he'd shown up with a stranger. Jonah had slept in the Cross bunkhouse enough times to know Ephraim never asked unnecessary questions. "Plenty of room here," Ephraim said simply. "Get her warm." The simplicity of their welcome seemed to disarm Sahale more than any kindness Jonah had offered. She hesitated a moment too long before following Martha inside, her hand lingering on the doorframe as though she feared the moment she entered. She'd owe these people more than she had left to give. Jonah watched her disappear into the kitchen, then carried his saddle and gear toward the bunkhouse. Yet something tugged at him, an unfamiliar urge to stay close, to make sure Sahale didn't vanish the moment he turned his back. The days that followed settled over the ranch like soft dust. Sahale helped Martha grind corn, mend clothes, and fetch water from the well. Her movements were quiet but steady, each action deliberate, as if doing work kept her upright when her heart threatened to pull her under. Martha spoke to her gently, filling silences without forcing conversation. Slowly, Sahale began offering small responses, soft yeses, small nods, rare smiles that lifted the corner of her mouth like ripples on still water. Jonah worked the north pasture with Ephraim, tightening fence lines that the storm had battered. He told himself he was too busy to notice every time Sahale stepped out to shake crumbs from a towel or hang herbs to dry. But his eyes kept drifting toward the house anyway, tracing the line of her shoulders, the fall of her hair, the way she stood with her weight slightly shifted warrior's balance, even in rest. One afternoon, Jonah found her behind the barn kneeling beside a colt whose hind leg trembled with pain. A coil of bent wire lay in the dust. Sahale stroked the colt's neck, whispering something in Apache, the words low and soothing. The animal, which had been fighting Ephraim all morning, stilled under her touch. Jonah approached slowly. "He's been kicking at that wire an hour," he said. "Didn't let a soul near him. He is afraid." Sahale replied without looking up. "Fear makes even gentle creatures forget themselves." Her fingers brushed the colt's flank. Jonah crouched beside her, working the wire loose with careful hands. When the final twist came free, the colt jerked once, then settled again under Sahale's palm. Jonah found himself staring at her, at the calm strength in her face, at the fierce tenderness she seemed to possess without effort. "You've got the touch," he murmured. Sahale looked at him then, truly looked, and for a moment Jonah felt as though she saw past his skin, past his calluses and weather-worn clothes, right into the part of him he kept locked away. "It is not touch," she said softly. "It is trust." The words hung between them, warmer than the sun that beat down on the barn roof. That evening, Martha asked Sahale to bring Jonah a mug of coffee out to the porch. The sky burned orange as the sun lowered behind the mesquite-dotted ridges. Jonah sat sharpening his knife until Sahale approached, her footsteps light on the wooden boards. She held out the mug without a word. He took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest instant, and something passed between them, something quiet but undeniable. They stood side by side, watching the sky shift through shades of gold, copper, then violet. When Sahale finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father taught me that people remember everything," she said, "even what they wish they could forget." Jonah's hand tightened around the mug. He didn't dare look at her. Memories can be stubborn, pain more so. He exhaled slowly. "You're not wrong." The crickets began their evening song, filling the air with a soft tremor. Jonah felt a strange ache growing in his chest, a longing he hadn't felt in years, not just for company, but for peace, for stillness beside someone who understood the weight of silence. A few days later, as dusk pooled across the valley, Jonah found Sahale standing by the fence that bordered the pasture. Her hair caught the dying light, glowing faintly like a black feather dipped in gold. He walked up beside her, not sure why his voice felt tight when he spoke. "I used to fear nights like this," he admitted, "back when, before everything fell apart." She shifted her gaze toward him. "It is the dark you fear, or what hides inside it." Jonah swallowed. "What it reminds me of." Sahale turned to face him fully. She reached up and lightly touched the faint white scar along his jaw, a careful, feather-soft gesture that stole his breath. "Pain shapes us," she said, "but it doesn't have to own us." Jonah didn't move, didn't breathe. That small touch felt like a hand pressed to a wound he'd carried too long, reminding it that healing was still possible. They stood together until the sky went black and the first stars blinked awake over high Mesquite Valley. No promises were spoken, no confessions made, yet something had shifted with the quiet certainty of roots taking hold in softened earth. Whatever bound them now was no longer accident or circumstance. It was choice, unspoken, fragile, beginning to grow. Summer heat rolled into high Mesquite Valley in a slow, breathless wave, the kind that made every board on the ranch house creak and every horse flick its tail in irritation. Jonah felt the shift in the air long before the sun dipped toward evening. Some part of him, an instinct honed by years of drifting, knew peace never lingered long out here. Not when a woman like Sahale carried a truth dangerous enough to draw men back from the dead. Sheriff Josiah Cook arrived coated in dust, his horse lathered and trembling. Jonah saw his expression before the man even spoke, and his stomach tightened. "Maddox back in the valley," Cook said, swinging down from his saddle, voice low and urgent. "He's asking after an Apache woman